So I've talked about toxic leaders, counterproductive leaders in a number of my videos, and I'm about to ask a question now that perhaps maybe you never thought would be asked. And that is, what does Jesus say about toxic leaders? Does he have anything to say at all? And the answer is absolutely he does, yes. In John chapter 10, the story of the Good Shepherd, which is perhaps the most important to me, significant statement the Bible has about effective leadership. And so I want to actually look at that passage in a couple of videos. And this one, I do want to ask the question, what did Jesus say about toxic slash counterproductive leaders? And so we're going to, before we look at that, I want to just kind of set the conditions. And I want to share with you what the Army says in Army doctrine are 5 negative, destructive leadership styles. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to identify these styles, and then we're going to see if we can find them in John chapter 10. So normally in my videos that I've done on toxic leadership, I've focused on ADP 6-22, which is an Army doctrine publication about Army leadership. And it's got a chapter in it about counterproductive leaders. But there's another regulation, AR 600-100, that also discusses counterproductive leadership. And in chapter 1, paragraph 11, it outlines the 5 destructive Army leadership behaviors. It identifies them. So in the first one, for example, is what the Army calls incompetent managers. And this is what it says. It says they possess inadequate cognitive or emotional fitness or have inadequate prior experience to function at their level. They cannot move from the tactical to the strategic level when so required. They cannot make sound decisions on time. So they're just out of their league. They're just submerged. They're just over their heads. Number 2 is the affable non-participant. The Army says that the affable non-participant might be interpersonally skilled and intellectually sound, but they are incapable of taking charge, making decisions, and providing timely guidance and holding subordinates accountable. Affable non-participants provide minimal guidance, avoid decisions, and are fond of committees, meetings, visitors, and often lack passion or creativity. So these are people that make no decisions, offer no guidance. You really don't know who they are or what they stand for because they just don't stand for anything. They just keep the ball rolling. Number 3 is the insensitive, driven achiever. These leaders are usually bright and energetic and consumed by need for a unit accomplishment and its attendant recognition. They must have mission success. They often provide impressive short-term results but create a frenzied, micromanaged climate. They are frequently inattentive to the morale of their organization. So these folks, as it says in the title, they are driven to achieve, but they do it at the expense of the people that work for them and are often clueless as to the impact they have on their organization. Number 4, check out the title for this guy. Toxic self-centered abuser. So this is the insensitive driven achiever on steroids. Toxic self-centered abuser. These leaders are also usually bright and energetic, as well as goal-oriented and boss-focused. They are capable of producing spectacular, is the word the Army uses, short-term results, but are arrogant, abusive, intemperate, distrusting, and irascible. They are typically distrusting of micromanagers, never burdened by introspection. So they don't use people, they abuse people. They torture people, kill people, bully people, run them down in public, do anything to lift themselves up. So it's not about really mission success, it's about personal success for the toxic, self-centered abuser. Lord, have mercy for the person who works under that person. And then finally, the Army identifies as the criminal. So we're kind of going from better to worse, if you will, as far as toxic leadership. And the Army says the criminal, these individuals may be energetic, bright, and sometimes charismatic. However, they cheat, lie, steal, defraud, and assault. And so there we have the criminal. So there are the 5 destructive leadership styles. They all find their place somewhere in John chapter 10. So in John chapter 10, what Jesus does is he lays out who the good shepherd is and how the good shepherd acts, the good leader, but he also has 3 leadership antagonists, 3 negative leadership prototypes that stand out. And in these 3 negative leadership prototypes, we see the thumbprints of these 5 destructive behaviors. So for example, in verse 1, Jesus says in John chapter 10, verse 1, "Very truly I tell you, Pharisees, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber." So right off the bat, Jesus introduces us to a toxic leader, the thief and the robber. And he says that this person can be identified because they don't go in the right way to leadership. They go over the gate, or they go over the fence. They don't come in by the gate, which is the normal way people become leaders. And so right off the bat, there's this questioning of integrity. There's this nefarious, questionable way that they arrived at their position of leadership. He goes on to mention them again in verse 8. "All who have come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep have not listened to them." So the sheep do not listen to this type of leader. They check out. And then finally he mentions them again in verse 10. It says, "The thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. I have come," the good shepherd has come, that they, the sheep, may have life and have it to the fill. So Jesus says that this thief or this robber, its purpose is to steal, kill, and destroy. It is simply about selfish motivations, whatever it can get for itself. So you ask yourself, which of the 5 leadership styles is Jesus talking about there? Which of the 5 destructive leadership styles does Jesus identify with the thief and the robber? For me, it's clear that's the criminal. Jesus talking about the leader that only lies, cheats. That's the criminal. That one's easy. It gets harder from here. In verse 5, Jesus says this. He says, well, I'll start with 4. "When the good shepherd has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from the stranger because they do not recognize the stranger's voice." So here Jesus is talking about the second negative leadership prototype, the stranger. And he says that the sheep don't follow a stranger. Why? Because they do not recognize the stranger's voice. So we ask the same question. Which of the 5 destructive leadership behaviors or styles is Jesus referring to in the stranger? Could it be the affable non-participant? The leader who never makes decisions, and people really don't know what they stand for because they never give real clear guidance or say this is what needs to be done. They might be friendly, but they're always friendly at an arm's length. It's the leader that really has no voice because we don't know what they stand for. We don't know who they are or what their values are. Or could it be maybe not the affable non-participant, maybe the insensitive driven achiever? The one driven by results and success and accomplishment and production and progress, and has no time or care for relationships because that's not the end they're looking for. This leader has a voice. It's a negative voice. It's a voice that the sheep don't want to follow. They recognize it, they see it, and they just don't want to follow that because it's a negative voice. It's the same thing for the toxic, self-centered abuser who's all about self-success and self-promotion. That leader also has a voice that's identifiable and recognizable, but it's a destructive voice that the sheep do not want to be around. So for me, when Jesus is talking about the stranger in verse 5, he's talking about the affable, non-participant, toxic leader, the one that really doesn't have a voice. The sheep cannot figure out because he never she never puts anything clear out there as far as guidance, that we can understand their motivation, that we can understand their priorities, that we can understand their values. It's a leader without a voice. And it's very difficult to follow that kind of person. That's the stranger in verse 5. And then we have maybe my favorite, the hired hand, in verses 12 through 13. Let me read that to you now. It says, the hired hand is not the good shepherd and does not own the sheep. So the hired hand is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. This is I think the most interesting negative leader prototype Jesus puts out. And we're going to do a video just upon those two verses pretty soon. But this hired hand doesn't own the sheep, Jesus says, doesn't care about the sheep, and runs away when the wolf comes, when challenge comes, is just out of there. The hired hand is in it for the money. Doesn't really care about the sheep. The no ownership of the situation. So, who's this when it comes to the 5 destructive army leadership styles? Is it the insensitive, driven achiever who's about mission success and unit success, which ultimately leads to my success? The insensitive, driven achiever uses the sheep for his personal gain. The insensitive, driven achiever uses his or her people for their own personal gain. So is the hired hand the insensitive, driven achiever, or is the hired hand the toxic, self-centered abuser who's simply all about my success? And remember, the toxic, self-centered abuser does not use the sheep for personal gain. He or she abuses the sheep for personal gain, tortures them, hurts them. Isn't all about this, I don't care about you, I just need for me. It's, I am going to hurt you in order that I can step on your back for my success. They abuse the sheep for personal gain. So which is this hired hand? To me, Jesus doesn't talk about the hired hand abusing the sheep, but it is clear he doesn't care about the sheep, or she doesn't care about the sheep. And so to me, the hired hand is most likely the insensitive, driven achiever. That kind of leader that simply sees the sheep as a tool for their own success. The insensitive, driven achiever simply sees his or her staff and all those underneath them as simply tools to their own success. And so here we have just an introduction to John chapter 10. Also at the same time, an introduction to Army doctrine, particularly the 5 destructive leadership styles, where we have the incompetent manager, the affable non-participant, the insensitive driven achiever, the toxic self-centered abuser, and the criminal, which line up with the 3 negative leadership prototypes in John chapter 10. The thief and the robber, the stranger, and the hired hand. So there's more to follow, but I thank you as always for listening to this. May this help you on your leadership journey. May you walk in peace. May you have the best day possible, and may you stay awesome.